Welcome to everyone. We're delighted to have you here at the first library lecture of the academic year. My name is Megan Mulder, and I'm a Special Collections Librarian, and you're welcome here on behalf of the library. We are very happy to start off our season this year with Charlie Lovett. Many of you know Charlie Lovett already, but for those of you who don't, I will tell you a little bit about him. I will be very brief, which is hard with Charlie because he's done a wide variety of really interesting things. But I'll be short, so we have time for Charlie to talk. He is obviously a novelist, which is what he's going to be talking about today, Bookman's Tale. And he's also going to be giving a sneak preview of his next novel, so very exciting. He's also written and published works of nonfiction. He's a prolific playwright. Those of us who are current and former Summit School students or parents appreciate the work that he and his wife Janice did for many years as resident playwright. Director and wrangler of third graders. So he is a multi-talented person. He is also no stranger to this library. He's the son of a Wake Forest English professor, so he's logged plenty of hours in the stacks. He also knows his way around a rare books collection, as if you've read the book, you can tell that. He has also been a professional antiquary and book dealer. And still is a very serious collector and an expert on the publications of Lewis Carroll. So he comes by all the knowledge that you saw in the book, honestly. We are delighted to have him here. He's going to talk a little bit about his book. There will be plenty of time to ask any questions, and I would like to encourage you to ask any questions that you have about the book. If you've read the book, you probably noticed that a lot of the action takes place in a school not entirely unlike Wake Forest, and in a special collections not entirely unlike this one, which is not entirely coincidental. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. I will also just say Charlie will be signing books afterwards, so if you brought books, that's great. If you need to purchase books, the Wake Forest Bookstore is selling them out in the hallway. And also, if you have the opportunity, we have some materials on exhibit here that coordinate with Charlie's appearance today and some of the things mentioned in his book. Actually, some of the items are from Charlie's personal collection in the cases. And also, Deborah Harkness will be here on Friday, so come back on Friday to hear her and get materials from her materials from her books too. And finally, if you haven't gotten enough of Charlie and you want to see him again, he's going to be moderating a panel at the Bookmarks Book Festival on Saturday, and feel free to pick up a brochure right there. So please join me in welcoming Charlie.
Listening to that introduction, I'm like, God, this guy must be really ADD, which is probably true. I'm glad to see that this is just like church and nobody sits in the front row, so I can dance across these chairs. This may be the first event. I've done a lot of these events now since the book came out on the 28th of May. It's definitely the first one I've done in a rare book room, which is nice because a lot of the book does take place in a rare book room, including activities that the rare book librarians here would probably rather not.
I should point out that we have a 24-hour surveillance camera. And we're not going to ask you this based on personal experience.
So I think this is the first one of these that I've done here, and for a primarily university audience. So having said that, my approach to these sessions is really antithetical to the university approach. That is to say, I prefer the kindergarten approach. So what we'll do is we'll have story time. We'll have some little lessons. We will definitely have show and tell. This is a really great place for show and tell, but I brought a little bit of my own show and tell as well. And we'll have sharing, questions and answers, and hopefully not nap time. But I realize it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and I can understand that. So I'd like to start I'm going to read just the opening about 3 or 4 pages of the Bookman's Tale, get us up to what we in the writing biz call the precipitating incident, so you'll know what it's all about, and then talk about it a little bit, and we'll go from there. I guess that if you read this on your e-reader, it numbers the chapters, because I keep getting emails from people that say, I'm on chapter 36. I'm like, there is no chapter 36. Maybe they're not really reading the book. Hay on Wye, Wales, Wednesday, February 15th, 1995. Wales could be cold in February. Even without snow or wind, the damp winter air permeated Peter's top coat and settled in his bones as he stood outside one of the dozens of bookshops that crowded the narrow streets of Hay. Despite the warm glow in the window that illuminated a tantalizing display of Victorian novels, Peter was in no hurry to open the door. It had been 9 months since he'd entered a bookshop. Another few minutes wouldn't make a difference. There had been a time when this was all so familiar, so safe, when stepping into a rare bookshop had been a moment of excitement, meeting a fellow book lover, a part of a grand adventure. Peter Byerley was, after all, a bookseller. It was the profession that had brought him to England again and again, and the profession that brought him to Hay on Wye, the famous town of books just over the border in Wales, on this dreary afternoon. He had visited Hay many times before, but today was the first time he had ever come alone. Now, as the cold ache in his extremities crept toward his core, he saw not a grand adventure, but only an uncomfortable setting, a stranger, and the potential for shyness and unease to descend into anxiety and panic. Anticipation brought cold sweat to the back of his neck. Why had he come? He could be safe in his sitting room with a cup of tea right now, instead of standing on a cold street corner with a sense of dread settling into the pit of his stomach. Before he could change his mind, he forced himself to grasp the door handle, and in another second, he was stepping into what should have been welcoming warmth. "Afternoon," said a crisp voice through a haze of pipe smoke that hovered over a wide desk. Peter mumbled a few syllables, then slipped through an open doorway into the back room, where books lined every wall. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the cocoon of books shielding him from all danger, inhaling deeply that familiar scent of cloth and leather and dust and words. His rushing pulse began to slow, and when he opened his eyes, he scanned the shelves for something familiar, a title, an author, a well-remembered dust jacket design, anything that might ground him in the world of the known. Just above eye level, he spotted a binding of beautiful blue leather that reminded him of the calf he had used to bind another book. Could it have been nearly 10 years ago? He pulled the book from the shelf, reveling in the smooth, luxurious feel of the leather. Taking a closer look at the gold stamping on the spine, Peter smiled. He knew this book. If not an old friend, it was certainly an acquaintance, and the prospect of spending a few minutes between its covers calmed his nerves. An inquiry into the authenticity of certain miscellaneous papers by Edmund Malone was a monument of analysis that unmasked one of the great forgers of all time, William Henry Ireland. Ireland had forged documents and letters purporting to be written by William Shakespeare, and even the original manuscripts of Hamlet and King Lear. Peter turned past the marbled end papers to the title page. It was a copy of the first edition of 1796. He loved the feel of heavy 18th century paper between his fingers, the texture of the indentation made on the page by the letterpress. He flipped a few pages and read. It has been said that every individual of this country whose mind has been at all cultivated feels a pride in being able to boast of our own great dramatic poet, Shakespeare, as his countryman. And proportionate to our respect and veneration for that extraordinary man ought to be our care of his fame and of those valuable writings he left us. Peter smiled as he recalled reading those valuable writings from an actual copy of the First Folio, that weighty 1623 volume of Shakespeare's works, in which many of his plays were printed for the first time. He was calm now, all sense of dread and panic banished by the simple act of losing himself in an old book. Remembering how that First Folio, given the opportunity, always fell open to the third act of Hamlet, he spread the covers of them alone and let the pages fall where they would. The book opened to page 289, revealing a piece of paper about 4 inches square. The brown foxing on the pages between which the paper had been pressed told Peter it had been there for at least a century. Out of habit more than curiosity, he turned the paper over. The sharp pain that stabbed his chest almost made him drop the book onto the dusty floor. He thought he had outrun that pain, that he could escape it with distance and distraction, but even in the corner of a bookshop in Hay on Wye, it had found him. Knees suddenly weak, he slumped against a bookcase and watched, as if in a dream, as the paper fluttered to the floor. The face was still there. He closed his eyes, willing the face and all that went with it to retreat, willing his pulse to slow once more and his hands to stop shaking. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. She lay there calmly, serenely, looking up at him, waiting. It was his wife. It was Amanda. But Amanda was dead, buried 9 months ago in the red earth of North Carolina, an ocean away, a heartbeat away. And this painting, so much older than Amanda or her mother or her grandmother, could not possibly portray her, but it did. Peter leaned over to retrieve the paper from the floor and examine it more closely. It was an expert watercolor, almost imperceptibly signed with the initials B.B. He looked again at the book from which it had fallen, hoping for a clue to the watercolor's origin. On the front end paper was a penciled interlocking E.H., the monogram of some long-forgotten owner. The description printed on a card inside the cover made no mention of a watercolor, only the price, £400. He'd seen copies cataloged for half that, copies that didn't hide a century-old painting of his dead wife. On the shelf in front of him was a shabby copy of Dickens' unfinished final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. The original cloth binding was worn at the corners and spine, and the hinges were broken, and a few pages were loose, but nothing was missing. He could easily restore it to be worth 2 or 3 times the asking price. Glancing around, he found himself still alone in the room. His hand trembling, Peter slipped the watercolor into Edwin Drood. He could not leave Amanda here so far from home. He reshelved them alone and tucked Drood under his arm. 20 minutes later, he had purchased a stack of books, including the Dickens, and was walking toward the car park on the outskirts of town, 2 heavy bags hanging at his sides. Now, my experience has been that the early reviewers of this book largely fall into 2 categories, and that is those who are not antiquarian booksellers, and those who are angry that Peter stole the watercolors. So let's talk about that for a moment. If you've ever been in high school, and I suspect looking out here that a few of you have been in high school much more recently than I have, we had in my high school this English composition assignment where we had to take a work of literature and we had to talk about how the opening passage of that work encapsulated the entire work of literature. I did, if you ever have this assignment, I recommend that you do Twelfth Night. That's what I did. If music be the food of love, play on, all that. But I think you could also use the Bookman's Tale for that pretty well, because what the Bookman's Tale is about is all the things you just heard about in those 4 pages. Rare books, a widowed guy who's not handling his grief very well and has an anxiety disorder, forgery, William Shakespeare, petty theft, and other crimes. I made a list of all the crimes in the book one time. It's a really long list. So I think if you're interested in those kind of things, then you may be interested in the book. But the subtitle of the book, A Novel of Obsession, was not chosen by me. Choosing the title is a whole other long story. But the subtitle was suggested by someone at Penguin, and I thought it was great. I loved it. It made me immediately look at the book in a whole new way. And it made me think about what is obsession. And I think, at least in the world of the Bookman's Tale, obsession is passion without moral compass. Peter is passionate about 2 things in his life, about rare books and about Amanda. And when those passions are carried to the extreme that his moral compass no longer points due north, we would call it obsession. In this case, it leads to him stealing a watercolor. Now, for other characters in the book, these obsessions lead to severely greater skewing of the moral compass than it does for Peter. So let me tell you a little bit about how the book is put together. The Bookman's Tale is told in 3 time frames. Depending on who you are, you either think it's really easy to follow or you think it's confusing. Although, interestingly, almost all of the amateur reviewers didn't have any trouble following it at all. It was only a couple of professional reviewers who thought that the amateurs might have trouble. The reason you won't have too much trouble following the 3 different time periods is because my agent very wisely suggested that we put a heading at the beginning of each section telling us when and where we are. And I see people nodding who have read it. So the first time period, you just heard the beginning of. It's 1995, and it's the story of Peter Byerly, a widower who is sort of retreated to his little cottage in the English countryside to basically not deal with his grief very well. And he starts to enter back into the world of rare books. He's an antiquarian bookseller. And he finds his watercolor. And it's the story of the sort of rabbit hole that he gets led down as he tries to discover the story behind this watercolor that seems to be, and yet cannot possibly be, a portrait of his wife. Part of that journey leads him also to discover an artifact that I think, if it really existed in real life, any rare book room would really like to have it on their shelves. An artifact that may have a lot to do with solving the question of Shakespeare's true identity, or the identity of the person who wrote Shakespeare's plays. I don't want to give too much away, but that's what happens in the first storyline. And Peter ends up in that sort of classic mystery thriller situation that Hitchcock loved so much, where the bad guys are after him and the police are after him all at the same time. Then the middle story takes place in the mid-1980s, and that's the story of Peter's years mostly at Ridgefield University, which is a fictional university in North Carolina. Some people have said, well, where's Ridgefield from? Well, I would say that the layout of the campus is very much Davidson College, which is where I went to do my undergraduate work. The geographical location is more sort of Duke. It's kind of in the eastern part of the state. But the library is definitely all Wake Forest. And the library, of course, is the place that Peter gravitates to, and it's where he first is introduced to the world of rare books. But Ridgefield is also where he first meets Amanda. So in the middle story, we kind of learn about how he falls in love with both rare books and with Amanda. And that gives me as a writer the opportunity to give the reader information that they need about rare books. They need that information to understand what's going on in the front story. But instead of doing, I don't see him here in the audience, and one of these days I'm going to get in really big trouble for saying this, but instead of pulling a Dan Brown and just stopping for like 20 pages and giving you a long lecture about Leonardo da Vinci or something, I really wanted that information to be more organic to the text of the book. And so by going through Peter's sort of training in the world of rare books with him, you learn the things that you need to know to start to unpick the mystery that's going on in the front story. And then the last story is the one that a lot of people have the most fun with, even though it's the one that we don't spend as much time with the characters. But it's the story of this artifact that Peters finds, this rare book. And it starts out in 1592 in a tavern on the south bank of the Thames with some characters named Christopher Marlowe and Robert Greene and eventually William Shakespeare. Robert Cotton, the great Elizabethan collector of books, shows up. And that story starts at 1592 and it goes until 1879. And that timeline includes a lot of real people, not just the Elizabethans and the Jacobeans that I mentioned, but quite a few other book collectors, forgers, scholars, even some politicians from that sort of 300-year time period. So that's kind of the way the whole book is put together. One of the issues that I think the book brings up, and it's especially interesting to talk about in a place like this, and in this context of standing here amongst a lot of old books, is this question of what it is that physical books can do for us and to us that perhaps digital books cannot do. And it's a question I want to revisit in several different ways this afternoon. But the first thing I would point out is if you read the Bookman's Tale on your e-reader, and I'm not knocking the e-reader, I have one, I use it all the time, I love it when I'm traveling. I love nothing better than to be sitting in my sitting room in my cottage in England and go, you know what, I think I would like to read Sense and Sensibility again. And like 5 minutes later, I'm reading and I haven't even gotten my lazy self up off of the sofa. So I am not saying that the e-reader does not have its place. However, if you read the Bookman's Tale on your e-reader, there's a really cool thing that you missed. And this is the kind of thing that physical books can do. Physical books can include a sort of an unlocking of the text in their design and their creation that I don't think a digital book really can do quite the same way. I mean, the obvious thing is you have the cover and the dust jacket and everything, but there's a bit in Bookman's Tale where Peter binds a book for Amanda. And I thought this was going to end up getting cut because there's a lot of sort of technical binding terminology and stuff in it. And it turns out it's like a lot of people's favorite scene. They all love it. And it is, I mean, when I look back on it, I was like, oh, well, duh, it's his love letter to her, because we never actually see him writing a love letter, but we see him binding this book. So he binds this book for Amanda, and on the front cover, he stamps her initials in gold, right? So if you happen to have a copy of the Bookman's Tale, and I suggest that if you don't, you run off and get one, and you take this off, you will see what you will not see on the front cover of, for instance, Dan Brown's new book. You will see, I don't know why my initials would be stamped on the cover of Dan Brown's book. You will see that my initials are stamped on there in gold. And it's this wonderful connection between the text and the container that I think introduces some of the ideas of what, an e-book or a digitized book is a great way to contain text. But a physical book can be a lot more than simply a container for text. As we saw in that first little reading, it can be a container for all the things that people slip into it over the years. And as a bookseller, I can tell you, I've found some weird stuff in between the pages of books over the years. And I'm sure those of you who are librarians can say the same. But the physical book, there are just ways that we can interact with it. I had a question from somebody one time that said, when did you get interested in books? And I said, well, I think all of us who are interested in books got interested in books when we were 2 years old and somebody handed us something. It wasn't because they handed us a Kindle. It was because they handed us something that we could chew on, and we could feel, we could pat the bunny. And then eventually it was something that could pop up and it was in 3 dimensions. So all these ways that we would interact with books as a child that are very physical and very organic to the physical book itself. So having read a little bit from the first few pages, I want to read another little bit that's sort of set here in this library, because this is the part I always read, but I've never gotten to read it here in the library. So Peter goes to college and he gets a job working in the circulation department of the library, and he loves this because he realizes that books are this great thing that can sort of shield him from having to interact with other people. And circulation is great because he doesn't have to ever talk to anybody. He just goes and he gets his cart and puts the books back on the shelves where they go. But this is the passage, I'm going to skip a little bit, but this is the passage where he first meets his 2 passions. On a dark and rainy October day in his sophomore year, Peter Byerly wheeled his cart into the reading room and first laid eyes on the woman he would marry. She was sitting alone at a table, poring over a biography of William Morris. She sat ramrod straight, with her book propped on the table in front of her posture almost daring the work to get the better of her, while all around her students slumped with the weight of impending midterms. She wore, in place of the unofficial uniform of jeans and a t-shirt, an impeccably tailored black suit with pleated trousers and a crisp white blouse. Not a strand of her shoulder-length black hair was out of place. She was slim, though not as slim as most college girls aspired to be. She was tall, though not as tall as those girls whose height inspired envy among their peers. Both her figure and her stature were enhanced by the one quality completely lacking in most co-eds, but which she possessed in abundance: poise. He did not at first see that she was beautiful, though it would not take him long to notice. What he saw was that she was different, that she seemed, like himself, to inhabit a world on the margins of Ridgefield University. She did not fit in, and this intrigued him, made him want to shout, "Comrade." Peter slid quietly into a chair at the edge of the room and pulled a book from his cart. For the next 30 minutes he pretended to read while watching her. Except to turn a page, which she did frequently, she did not move. At 6 o'clock, she closed the book, put it on a pile of others, picked up the books and her red leather purse, and headed toward the exit. Peter followed. When she returned several of the books at the circulation desk, he swept them off the counter as soon as they'd been processed. 10 minutes later, he was sequestered in the stacks, perusing her books. In addition to the William Morris biography, there was a book on the pre-Raphaelite painter Holman Hunt, a volume of Edward Burne-Jones prints, and 2 volumes of the catalogue of the annual exhibition at London's Royal Academy of the Arts, 1852 and 1853. He glanced through the volumes of artwork and the Holman Hunt biography before reshelving them. The Morris biography he slipped into his bag without checking it out. He wasn't sure what made him do it. For some reason, he felt a need to illicitly possess a book she had read. He returned it to his shelf a week later, afraid that if she was as complex and multifaceted as Morris, she was way out of his league. Now, the bit I'm skipping, this goes on for about a month or so when Peter, either, depending on your point of view, either pines for her or stalks her. I mean, yes. The guys in the audience are going to go with pines for her. But he sort of spends a little bit of time each day, watching her, and he sees that she's checking out these volumes of the Royal Academy exhibitions at the rate of about 1 a week. And he sees that one of them that's coming up has got its cover loose. And so he goes to the conservation room and he asks the guy to put the cover back on, and they get into a discussion about rare books. And he says, "You like books, don't you?" And Peter's like, "Sure, I guess." And he says, "You should apply for this. There's a student position available up in the rare books room. You should apply for the job." So Peter decides he will, not really knowing what it is he's getting into. On November 15th, 1984, a pair of books in the Ridgefield Library transformed Peter's life. He had gone to the library after his 10 o'clock class, hoping to finish his shift before his 3:30 interview with Francis Leland in Special Collections. At 3, he picked up a cart of books to shelve and scanned it for anything that might have been returned by his mystery woman. In a matter of seconds, he found the repaired Royal Academy catalog. Smiling, he wheeled his cart toward the elevator. Not until he pulled the book out and was about to place it in its proper spot did he notice a crisp piece of ivory paper sticking out of it. She had never left a bookmark in a book before. He gently pulled the paper out of the book. At the top, printed in royal blue, was the initial A. Below that, in a neat script, was a note addressed "To my admirer." First of all, thank you for having this book repaired. I so hate having to handle damaged books. I'm always afraid I'll cause further injury. I've noticed you watching me, you know. I even followed you in the stacks one day. I've been hoping you would say hello, but since it's been a month and you haven't done it yet, I suppose I'll have to be the one to get things started. Meet me tonight at 10:30 in the snack bar at the Student Center. The letter was signed simply Amanda. Peter leaned against the steel bookcase and felt the cold metal through the fabric of his shirt. He had held his breath as he read the letter, and now he exhaled heavily as books seemed to swirl around him. After a minute, feeling somewhat steadier, he read the letter again to be sure he hadn't misunderstood. She wanted to meet him, to speak to him. She had noticed him, and her name was Amanda. Where had he heard that name before? Suddenly he remembered his appointment. He had only 5 minutes to get himself to the top floor of the library. He carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket, and then set off at a brisk pace for the Amanda Devereaux Rare Books room. Now, I should pause here and say that in the original drafts of the novel, this all got cut out. There was this whole thing about how the library was named after the great lost son of the family, who was an early aviator and was killed in a... It was a little too obvious. I think I even named it might have even been named Zach. I can't remember. It was something with a Z. Or no, he's Alexander, I think is what it was. But I digress. At 3:30, still slightly lightheaded from reading a different Amanda's letter, Peter sat at a massive oak table in the center of the Devereaux room, waiting to meet Dr. Francis Leland. The carved wooden chair in which he sat was a fine antique. Underfoot was a huge oriental rug, and facing him a large glass case displayed several medieval illuminated manuscripts. Above this case hung an imposing portrait of Amanda Devereaux. Around the room were 14 mahogany cases, each surmounted by a carved bust. From where he sat, Peter could read the names of Julius Caesar, Augustus, Cleopatra, and Caligula. Each of the 14 cases was filled with ancient-looking books. In front of him lay a slim volume bound in worn, dark brown leather with no markings on the cover. Next to it lay a pair of white cotton gloves. We used those back in the 1980s. After a few minutes of waiting in a silence not punctuated even by the ticking of a clock, Peter decided this must be a test. He pulled on the gloves and carefully opened the book. The pages were worn at the edges and looked soft as flannel. Peter turned to the title page and read, "The Tragical History of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark." At the bottom of the page was the publication date, 1603. Shakespeare had still been alive, Peter thought, and for the second time that day, the simple combination of ink and paper literally took his breath away. He felt thrilled, awed, privileged. How many people ever had the chance to hold a copy of Hamlet printed when Shakespeare was still alive? Fingers trembling, he turned to the first page of the text. He had read Hamlet in high school and again in freshman English, but this text was different. He had turned the page and read almost to the arrival of the ghost when he heard a soft voice behind him. Interesting reading. "It's not quite the way I remember it," said Peter, gently closing the book and laying it reverently on the table. He turned to see a short man with curly gray hair and horn-rimmed glasses. He wore not the tweed jacket that Peter had expected, but a pair of blue jeans and a red polo shirt. "It's called a bad quarto," said the man. "It's the first printing of Hamlet, but the text is inferior to later editions. Some scholars think it was plagiarized from memory by someone who saw a performance." "Still, it's the first printing of Hamlet," said Peter. "Yes, quite a fine," said the man. "I didn't mean to touch it, it's just quite all right," said the man. "There's no point in having these things if we don't ever have the pleasure of looking at them. What do you think of it?" Peter struggled to find the words to describe the experience of holding that book, turning those pages, reading those words printed while the author still lived and breathed and walked the streets of London. Until recently, books had been only something to hide behind. Then he had begun to see them as carefully crafted objects. But this was completely different. This was a revelation. This book was filled with history and mystery. Just being near it made Peter flush with emotion. "It's amazing," he said at last. He placed one cotton-gloved hand lightly on the book. He could almost feel its life pouring into his fingertips. I mean, the person who first owned this book, who first read these pages, might have seen the original production of Hamlet. He might have even known Shakespeare personally. So that's a book that I didn't invent the book per se. There is such thing as the bad quarto of Hamlet. But I invented a copy. There's only 2 excellent copies in the world. Sadly, one of them is not here. Otherwise, we would have it on display. I think there's one at Yale and one at the British Library, I'm pretty sure. So I invented a 3rd copy for Peter because I thought I really wanted Peter's first encounter with rare books to be something that was a book that even somebody who didn't know very much about rare books could understand the remarkableness of something like a copy of Hamlet printed when Shakespeare was still alive. I mean, almost anybody who is even vaguely educated can kind of get behind the fact that that's a pretty cool thing. Now, it's also interesting that I chose that book because after I had written the book, before it was sold, but after I finished the manuscript, and that book was in there, I had dinner with a guy named Stephen Massey, who's if you watch Antique Roadshow, you've probably seen him appraising books on Antiques Roadshow. I think he works for either Christie's or Sotheby's in New York, and he's been in the book world for a long, long time, and is a big book appraiser. And we got into this conversation about something that Peter talks about in the Bookman's Tale. He talks about the idea of the Holy Grail, that every book collector has their Holy Grail, that one book that more than any other you would like to find at the bargain box on the front of your local antiquarian bookshop, which is something we also used to have back in the 80s. Peter has his Holy Grail, and this is a conversation that I've had with other book collectors too. We sit around, and depending, if we're like Jane Austen collectors, we have some wine, and if we're William Faulkner collectors, we have some scotch, and then we say, what is your Holy Grail? So I said to Stephen Massey, just out of curiosity, I said, so, you working in a place like a big auction house, you're not a collector yourself, but you obviously it's exciting when you find books that are going to do well at auction. What's your Holy Grail? And without missing a beat, he goes, oh, bad quarto of Hamlet. So I was like, oh, good. I picked for Peter to get in touch with. I think I get the question a lot, and I'm not trying to keep you from asking questions because I hope you're going to ask a lot of questions. But the first question is always, how much are Peter and I alike? And the answer is pretty much not at all. Peter could never do what I'm doing right now. We both like books, and we both like the English countryside, and that's, other than that, we're very different people. But I think if there's one sentence in here, in this book, that encapsulates the way that I feel about rare books, it's what Francis Leland says when he first meets Peter. And Peter apologizes for picking up the book. He says, there's no point in having these things if we don't ever have the pleasure of looking at them. And that, for me as a book collector, the fun of it is when somebody comes into your house and you get to play show and tell. I mean, we all know from kindergarten that the tell part was not the interesting part of show and tell, right? You wanted to get your hands on the stuff. You wanted to pet the puppy and hold the journals. And so to me, that's, I feel very much, there are collectors, and Sophie Collingwood in my next novel runs into a couple of them who think that everything should be behind glass all the time and you should never touch it, you should never do it. And to me, then why do we have it if we don't ever have a chance to interact with it? One of the really fun experiences that's happened for me since the book came out is the chance to come to some places like this. I was invited over to the Rare Book Library at Emory by the librarian there, literally just to play show and tell. He just got out some cool stuff that we could look at. That I got to hold and turn the pages of my own great-grandfather's copy of the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is a really important early printed book that has 1,800 illustrations or something in it. It's just an amazing illustrated book from the 1490s. And then it was that right the way through, some great 19th century literature, and we had a lot of fun. And I got to come over here, and Megan has let me get my hands on some things. So I really very much agree with Francis, who says that there's no point in having. I mean, I think there's a line that you can tread between allowing people access to things, allowing people to interact with things, but still being responsible about their preservation. And I was really pleased to hear your new Rare Book Librarian sort of speak in those same terms, with the idea that a rare book collection should not be something that's hidden away under lock and key and that students and faculty in the community doesn't know about. It's something that we should all really have a wonderful time interacting with. So having said that, now I'm going to give you a little sneak preview. So my next novel, which we just sold to Viking last week, so I can now start talking about it. I don't usually like to read from works in progress, but it's done. There will be editing that will happen. So the piece I'm about to read you could end up on the cutting room floor, but I hope not, because I really like it. It is, instead of being in 3 time periods just to make your life a little easier, it's just in 2. I hope that will help. The front story is set in the present day. There's a reason that I chose to set Peter's story in the 1990s, because I really wanted Peter to be in the world of rare books the way that world was before the internet took it over. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but the way that we as collectors buy and sell rare books is, to today is completely different from what it was 20 years ago. And so I wanted Peter to be in that world where it has a lot more to do with going around in the basements of bookshops, and there's rust and there's dust and there's, you get your hand, you know, at the end of the day you have to wash your black hands because you've been pulling all these dusty books off of shelves. And, you know, I wanted him to be in that world. Sophie, the heroine of the new novel, is, you know, texting, and she lives in 2000. Well, the book's gonna come out in 15, so I guess she lives in 2015. Probably whatever she's doing will be old hat by then. There'll be some new thing. So we may have to go back and say that it was set in 2013. But she is a young woman who very much appreciates the world of rare books. She was introduced to that world by her uncle, and she has a mystery that she follows in the front story. And then the backstory is set, almost all of it, except for a little bit, almost all of it is set in Hampshire and the surrounding environs in the second half of 1796. And the main character in that story is a young woman named Jane Austen, who is only 19 years old and yet is just finished the first draft of the book that will become Sense and Sensibility, and is working on the first draft of the book that will become Pride and Prejudice. She's 19 years old. So it's really fun making change. And whereas at the Bookman's Tale, Shakespeare shows up as a character, but he's in one scene and he has like 4 lines. You know, I mean, if he were in a play, he would be, you know, down at the pub for most of the evening and have to come back for curtain call. You know, but in First Impressions, Jane Austen is a major character of almost half the book. So it was really fun to get to explore her as a fictional character. I had lunch with a couple of other authors, Melanie Benjamin and Erica Roebuck, who both write historical novels. Melanie's most recent novel is about Anne-Marie Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's husband, and Erica just wrote a novel called Hemingway's Girl, and then her new one is about Zelda Fitzgerald. And we were talking about, you know, writing historical fiction and how much research do you do. Again, that's another thing people ask about research. And they agree that you don't want to over-research a historical figure that you are planning to use as a fictional character, because you can get caught up on the truth with a lowercase t, you know, and miss out on the truth with a capital T. So in the case of my work with Jane Austen, I read the relevant passages of the first major biography of Jane Austen, which was written by her family. And so it's not a real, we can't, from scholarly point of view, it's not like an unbiased opinion of what kind of person she was. But all I wanted was, this is how old she was when she did this. She wrote this book from this month until this month. This is what the house looked like. I wanted facts. I wanted to work my story around the facts of her early life without worrying too much about anything else. As far as the character that I gave her, to me, it was just the character of the person that, having read the novels, that I think would write those novels, and that I think my readers would want to believe is the kind of person who wrote that novel. Bright, articulate, witty, incredibly witty, you know, fun to be around, thoughtful, energetic, likes to take long walks in the countryside, and so on and so forth. So in the process of her research, Sophie goes to St. John's College in Oxford, and she picks up a copy of this book. I'll just hold up the first volume. This is not mine. Sorry. I wish if it's missing tomorrow, you'll know where it went. She finds a copy of the first edition of Pride and Prejudice, and she opens it to this page. If you've never looked at it, you should look at it afterwards, because I'm sure you all know the words that are on this page, but I bet almost none of you have seen what they look like on this page, the way they look like to the people who first saw it. And so I'm just going to read you this little scene it's just her reading that page. She laid down the box and picked up one of 3 nearly identical volumes. Turning past the title page, which identified the author only as the author of Sense and Sensibility, she reached the beginning of the text. At the top of the page, in large outlined capital letters, was the title, Pride and Prejudice. Below that, a decorative line, then in small, bold capitals, the words, Chapter 1. And finally, that first glorious paragraph with a large initial I. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It took up 4 lines of text on the narrow paper and seemed all the more important for taking up more than 1/3 of the text space on the page. The words acknowledged and possession were both hyphenated. Those details, the narrowness of the book making the sentence cascade into nearly a third of a page, the initial capital, the hyphenated words, took that familiar sentence and made it look completely different. Sophie had never held a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. She had never had the opportunity to run her fingers over those spectacular words as they had appeared in print for the very first time. Somehow seeing them here in this volume from 1813 brought home to Sophie in a way even more powerful than seeing the manuscripts in the British Library had, that Jane Austen had actually written these words. They had not simply appeared out of the ether. Sometimes, Sophie thought, sentences like that become so famous that we cannot conceive a time when they did not exist. We can remember our own first encounters with those words, but that mankind should have had a first encounter with them seems almost impossible. But mankind did have a first encounter with Sophie's favorite sentence in all of literature, and she now held that first encounter in her hand. She felt a single tear trickle down her cheek. This was not the emotional release she had been seeking. It was not the outpouring of grief that remained bottled inside her. It was merely a reaction to the power of the connection she felt with this book. On the lower corner of the first page of the first edition of Pride and Prejudice, housed at St. John's College, Oxford, is a small circular water stain. It does not affect the text, nor is it significant enough to reduce the value of the book. But like every mark in every book, it tells a story. And like so many marks in so many books, it is a story known to only one person and doomed to be lost forever when that person is no more. It is the mark of a single tear that dropped from the cheek of Sophie Collingwood as she stared at those words, and it is a testament to the awesome power of literature. So I want to keep that little scene.
Yeah.
So that sort of brings us full circle back around to this idea of marks in books and ways that we can interact with a physical book that we maybe can't with a digital, and which means it's time for show and tell. But first that, just a quick word about titles. The original title of the Bookman's Tale is Marginalia, which those of you who are rare book people probably think is a great title, and everybody else in the whole world thinks it's a really rotten title. And it turns out the book sells better if people in addition to rare book people. But I love this idea. Part of the reason for that is that the artifact that Peter finds is filled with writing in the margins, writing that he suspects might be from William Shakespeare. And so, also in a very strict sense, it is a book, it is a novel about marginalia. But also I love this idea that Peter begins the book living at the margins of his life. And he talks about, in that passage that I read, he talks about how he sensed that Amanda was living in the margins of Richfield University. And by the end of life, Peter's sort of coming back to the center of the text of his life. So hopefully that's all there, even though that title is not there. But marginalia is just, I throw that out because that's an example of, again, something that, an e-reader is a great way to distribute the text of Pride and Prejudice. But if you want to see what 500 different people who actually read Pride and Prejudice wrote in the margins of it, I realize technically you can do that now. It's really creepy. I can go on Amazon and I can find out what passages people are highlighting in the Bookman's Tale. I'm like, why would I want to know this? I'm not sure. But the idea, for instance, if you come to my house, you can, I don't know why you would want to, but I had a scholar there the other day who thought this was the coolest thing ever. If you come to my house, you can see Aleister Crowley's very heavily annotated copy of The Hunting of the Snark. It's a great article waiting to be written. I'm not big into Aleister Crowley, so I'm not going to be the one to write it, but somebody will write it eventually. So that's something that a way that we can interact with books that we can't really do with digital files. I have to do a lot of these interviews, these online interviews, for the various publishers in Australia and England and the US, and I suspect that in every case, this is a job that is given to, and no offense to anybody here present, is given to the college intern. Because the questions that they send me are the kind of questions I can remember asking each other when we were in college, and we had a few, and it was like 2:30 in the morning, and you're like, what if, and so one of the questions is, if your house was burning down, what 3 books would you take with you? And I don't know why it has to have to be 3. I have 2 hands, but, So, the obvious thing is pick the 3 most expensive books in your house, but that'd be a really boring answer to the question. So this is one of the books that I put on my list. This book, you will probably not find in any rare book collection. I'm sure anybody here who's a rare book person will tell you that this book is probably not worth 50 cents. It is a high school French grammar textbook from the 50s that is incredibly worn and battered and written all over, and just generally if as a bookseller, when I used to be an antiquarian bookseller, this would not have made it onto the bargain shelf, really. We would have used it as a doorstop or something. But in the late 1990s, I was writing a book about my mother, who passed away when I was 2 years old. And I happened to find this book on the top of a bookshelf where it had been sitting for my entire life, and I had no idea it was up there. And when I opened it up, I saw, and this belonged to her. This was her high school French textbook. When I opened it up, I saw this. And so to me, you know, that's way cooler than finding her Kindle files. You know, that just sort of gives an immediate connection through something that's a physical book. So now this is silly for me to bring this here because I'm sure there are books that are much older than this in this book, but this happens to be the oldest book that I personally own. This is a copy of Pascal. If you're a freshman, you'll probably have to read this, from 1677. And if you read French, you can read this just as easily today as you could read it in 1677. It's in the original binding. It's nice and tight. The paper is well made. That it's 340 years old and it's doing just fine. There's no reason to suspect that it won't be around for at least another 340 years. And the reason I show you this is because we are being told as a society that the digitization of physical books is the way we are going to preserve knowledge for future generations. And I would put it to you that ink and paper is a really well-tested technology that we know from experience will preserve knowledge for future generations. This is 340 years old. Okay. Usually at this point I hold up my broken Kindle that I dropped on the floor, but I left it on. So after 340 years, this is still doing fine. I have no idea what the status of your digital files that you put on your e-reader is going to be 340 years from now, but I would be super surprised if anybody could read them. I have discs in my house that are 15 years old that nobody can read. You know, and another way to put this in perspective is that a lot of this digitization is being done by huge multinational corporations, Google being the most obvious one. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I have saved tens of thousands of dollars by being able to research from my desk rather than have to travel to libraries all over the world. It's not as much fun as traveling to libraries all over the world, but it is amazing when I'm working on research for a novel or on a work of nonfiction to be able to access the amount of things that you can access now. The British Newspaper Archive alone is worth the whole creation of the internet. It is amazing that I can search something like 15 million pages of newspapers, and I want to see, find out something about Lewis Carroll's father giving, talks to the local board of education. You could spend your life looking through those 15 million pages, or you can spend 75 pounds and then it takes you 10 seconds. It's incredible. So I'm not knocking digitization, but I am saying that Google's a big multinational corporation, and the big multinational corporation that was around when this book was printed, that ruled the world in a way that Google can only dream of, was a company called the East India Company. Now I'm curious, just with a quick show of hands, how many people here came tonight or this afternoon came here in an East India Company vessel? Anybody? How many have stock in the East India Company? Seriously? So we don't know where Google's going to be 340 years from now. And I think it's indicative, and this is a room that fights against this idea, but I think it's indicative of this idea that we have as a society that a long time is like 8 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years. When you see it in the way that corporations structure themselves, and you see it in a lot of things. So rare books are a great bulwark against that idea. And as it turns out, they're like a really, really good way to simply do the basic thing that we think of ebooks as being good at doing: store information. They're really good containers for information. So I bought a few other things. There is in the back there a little pamphlet called "Was Lord Bacon the Author of Shakespeare's Plays?" And that's a pamphlet that gets read by one of the characters in the Bookman's Tale. But the reason I brought that along, and I brought this is the original playbill for the Mikado, Gilbert Sullivan operetta. But it has in it pictures of other Gilbert Sullivan operettas, including HMS Pinafore. And this guy right here, Sir Joseph Porter, KCD, who I'm sure you all know if you went to see Jim Dodding's HMS Pinafore, is actually the same guy as the person who wrote that little booklet back there. And I just think his story is so cool that it's worth telling very quickly. I'm gonna do better with my show of hands this time. How many people have ever read a book, a newspaper, a magazine, or any other piece of reading material while in motion on a plane, a train, or an automobile? Okay, you have William Henry Smith to thank for this, the guy who wrote this little book. William Henry Smith was the father of a newspaper distributor, the son of a newspaper distributor. And he had the idea, when they started building these things called railways, that all of a sudden, you might actually be able to read while you were traveling. You could never do this before, because traveling was bouncing up and down. But railways were smooth. There is, I think, a great little exchange near the end of my novel First Impressions, where Jane Austen is talking to her sort of older mentor, and he says he wishes that when he was traveling, he could be in a room that would glide across the landscape so that he could read, and she tells him he's being ridiculously fanciful, there would never be such a thing. So William Henry Smith started to open basically newspaper stands and bookshops in train stations all around England. And if you have been to England any time in the last 150 years, and you have bought a newspaper or a magazine, there's a pretty good chance you bought it at W.H. Smith, which is still there. But he was also, as a successful businessman, he started to move up in the political world and eventually was made the Lord of the Admiralty, in spite of never having been on one of those boat things. And so Gilbert Sullivan decided to skewer him as Sir Joseph Porter, the monarch of the sea. He turns up in the Bookman's Tale as a character. But it's really fun to me to be able to, as this exhibit does, to have a physical book, a novel that I've written and that exists here in the present, interact with all of these other pieces from the past. And one of the things we talked about at the Decatur Book Festival this past weekend is that a great rare book really exists in the past and in the present at the same time. And the last thing I'll show you is a nice example. Oh no, there's two things I'm going to show you. Well, they're both nice examples of that. So this is, Peter writes about trying to open a book and not being successful because it turns out it's not a book, it's a slipcase. So I brought a book here that's in a slipcase. This is a copy of a book called The Vampire. This book was the loser of a very famous literary bet. In 1811, I think it was, in Geneva, there was a bet between Lord Byron and Mary Wollstonecraft and John Polidori and Percy Shelley, saying which of them could write the best Gothic novel. And Polidori wrote this one called The Vampire. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, so I think she wins. But this is the first edition of The Vampire, and the reason I have a copy of this is because this actually happens to be Lewis Carroll's own personal copy, and he has put his little monogram on it. But Peter talks about feeling what a letterpress type feels like. Come up and run your fingers across this and feel the way you interact with the texture of the page as the type. For some reason, Lewis Carroll had a first edition of The Vampire. He had a first edition of the first book ever written about werewolves. And he had a second edition, which is actually rarer than the first, a second edition of Frankenstein. I can only assume he was working on an Abbott Costello script. I don't know. So feel free to come up. I can't say this about your books, but feel free to come up and put your paws all over my books. And the last thing I'll show you, again, this is something that I think gives you that whole sense of the book existing in the past and in the present, and the way we can connect through a great old book that we can't do if it's not a physical object. This is a copy of Alice's Adventures Underground. This was the original manuscript story of Alice in Wonderland, that after the book became famous, Lewis Carroll decided that his readers might want to see its original format, and so he went back and published a facsimile of the manuscript that he had actually given to Alice, and which now sits in the British Museum. But this particular copy is inscribed, "Presented to Henry A. Hetherington by Lewis Carroll, as a memento of his having taken part in the dream play Alice in Wonderland, written by H. Saville Clark and first produced Christmas 1886. Now, if you collect Lewis Carroll, and if you wrote a book about that particular play, and if you're also a children's playwright, you would probably think this is really cool. I happen to be all of those things, so I think this is really cool. But again, this is, to me, this connects me not just to the author, but to a specific event in his past, to a child actor who Henry Hetherington is not a famous person. He didn't probably act in anything after he did that play when he was 8 years old. But yet, I'm still connected to him. I'm connected to all the people who didn't take particularly good care of this book, which in a way I love. It's almost better than if it were in perfect condition, because this tells me people read this, people spilled stuff on it, people left this under the table. It's been well loved. So again, that gives, I get a sense when I hold a book like this that I'm not going to get from something that's not the full-on physical object. Having said all that, how are we doing over here? Oh man, I just wandered on and on and on. So let's take some questions. I hope there will be some questions. Yes?
I have a silly question.
There are no silly questions.
How big was the watercolor that Peter found?
I think it says it's about 4 inches square.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's pretty small. The book that it was in, I think there might be a copy of it back there. Is there?
I don't know if that's the first, there may be, there's something.
There's certainly a copy of the book in the stacks at Wake Forest, because this is where I came to find the quote that I used out of the book. Yeah.
Is, and I for this one, Hay on Wye a real place?
Yeah, Hamwa is a real place. All of the places in the book are real, except for their houses that I invented, but all the towns are real. The town of Kingham is very real. I'm on my way there next week. But yeah, Hay on Wye is this town that in the 60s sort of started. There was this crazy guy who bought an abandoned castle in Hay and started buying. He would go to book auctions, and anytime somebody didn't bid on a lot, he would buy it. And pretty soon he had like 250,000 books shoved in this castle. And people started coming to buy books. And then somebody else would open a bookshop around the corner, and somebody else would, and pretty soon the whole town was full of bookshops. And in its heyday, no pun intended, which I think really was in the mid '80s, before the internet took over. You couldn't really call yourself a rare book collector if you didn't spend some time in Hay once in a while. Now, to me, sadly, one of the great stores there got bought by an American, and she took all of their theological stock, I was told, and dumped it in the street to make room for a coffee shop. No offense to libraries that have coffee shops in them, but but it's still a great place to go for books. Though. Yes.
What was the editing process like for you? Was that a surprise?
Yeah, it was interesting because this is my 14th book, but it's my first big book. I tell people it's like I was playing stickball in my backyard for a long time, and then the Yankees called up and said, "Do you want to come play stickball for us?" So it was different for me. I did a lot of. I had written it and edited it myself several times before it finally found an agent who was enthusiastic about it, and I did one rewrite for him. He gave me one instruction. He said, if the book is a balancing act between everything that has to do with rare books and then everything else, he wanted less of A and more of B. And this may not be the right crowd to tell this particular story to, but he was absolutely right, because there were a lot of rare book things in there that were only in there because I thought they were cool, not because they were necessary to telling the story that I was trying to tell. So that was the first big rewrite. Then, once the book sold to Penguin, my marvelous editor, Catherine Court, who's the president of Penguin USA, and who's an English woman who's spent most of her adult life living in America. I'm an American who spends as much time in England as I can, so we get along like a house of fire. I did some minor things for her, and then one fairly major rewrite, and a lot of that was more organizational than anything else. I did have to cut about 40 pages, which is a lot. It's like it's almost like you have to take 1 or 2 words out of every single sentence in the book, pretty much. But it wasn't as hard as it seemed like, because again, you start to see paragraphs and pages that may be well written and may be interesting, but they're not really about what your book is about. The farther you get into it, the more you start to be able to focus in. But the last big part of that edit, in addition to the cutting, was she wanted the sections, especially at the beginning, she wanted the sections to be longer. I know they're pretty short. They were even shorter before. And so she wanted them to be a little bit longer so that the reader would be a little more grounded in each of those 3 storylines, not have to shift gears quite as often. And that, at one point, I had every scene in the book described in a single sentence on a slip of paper, and all of those pieces of paper laid out on a huge table, and I was like constantly rearranging because I wanted longer sections, but the reader still has to find things out in a certain order, and I still wanted parallel connections between the different sections so that if one section is dealing with forgery and in another section he's learning about forgery, and in another section there's a forger who's actually working forging things, you know, those kind of connections. And then beyond that, it was just copy editing, which is the easy bit. But the folks at Penguin were great. I will be editing the next book probably in November, so we'll be back at it. She hasn't said anything about the title yet, so maybe I get to keep my title. Does anybody know what the title First Impressions refers to? Yeah, it was the original working title of the novel that became Pride and Prejudice. So my agent said to me, he wasn't sure about the title, and he said, "So would a hardcore Jane Austen fan know that?" He wasn't worried about like the man on the street. So, well, I had an easy way to pull. I called Bob Lovett on the phone, and I said, "Bob, what was the working title of Pride and Prejudice?" He goes, "First Impressions." I'm like, "Thank you." You know, and then I called my agent back and I said, "Yes, a hardcore Jane Austen fan." Yeah.
Peter's last name is Byerly.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering if you did that on purpose and what your reasons were.
I don't know. I just like the name. Yeah, it doesn't.
He buys books, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really refer to anything. And, you know, I have a brother named Peter, and so when he came to one of these things, of course, I just didn't even wait for him to ask the first question. I answered it myself. Peter's name doesn't come from anywhere. And it's not even that he's a rock, because he's really not a rock. I mean, he is Leron. Sometimes I really struggle with names. For the Jane Austen book, I had a lot of names of people who were living in 1796, and I have this 4-volume reference work that's a little mini biography of everybody who graduated from Oxford University from like 1590 to 1886 or something, and it's a great place to look for old-fashioned names. But Peter's name was, I don't know, that was just always his name. I'm not sure why, but he just, and I actually thought about changing it because of the fact that I had a brother Peter. Because when you first start writing a novel like this, I did not start writing this novel thinking that it was going to be in a big display in every single Barnes and Noble in the country. That was, I thought, you know, maybe my wife and a few other people might read it if I was lucky. So you don't, I mean, with First Impressions, it's very different because I knew there was a very good chance that it was going to get bought by a major publisher. And so you do approach it differently. And you don't necessarily just go, I don't know, name it Peter Byerly, whatever. You know? But in the case of Peter, it really was almost that simple. Yeah.
What is one of the coolest rare book treasures you've ever had the opportunity to examine?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I mean, and one of my favorite books is over here in the glass case is the Kelmscott Chaucer, which is an edition of Chaucer that looks like it's done in the 15th century, but is actually a 19th century production that was created by William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. And is one of the things that first got me interested in William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, who turns out both did other things besides print books. And that book actually shows up in the Bookman's Tale because I knew there was a copy here. About, I don't know, 20 or 25 years ago, when I was an antiquarian bookseller, I wrote a column for a short-lived magazine, probably called Winston-Salem Magazine, something like that. And one of the first columns I wrote was about that book and about the fact that there was one here at Wake Forest, because I had been in one day in Lichfield, England. I went to that's where Dr. Johnson lived, Dr. Samuel Johnson. I went to the Samuel Johnson house and saw not one but many copies of the first edition of Johnson's dictionary, which is pretty awesome, and that shows up in First Impressions. And then we walked across the street to Lichfield Cathedral, and we saw a copy of the King James Bible. And I remember thinking that day, if I could if I could see a first folio today, that's the English language. Those 3 books. I mean, without those 3 books, the English language is so much poorer than it really is. So that was a pretty cool day. You know, and then, you know, the stuff that they have in the British Library, you know, the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf, which again shows up in Bookman's Tale, the manuscript book of Alice in Wonderland, and those things sit in such an interesting context. There'll be a Jane Austen manuscript, and then in the next case, there's like the original handwritten lyrics for Yesterday. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, God, Brits really had it coming and going. So I don't know, there's a lot. Yeah.
You have a holy grail.
I guess I would say that, especially given the fact that almost by its nature, the Holy Grail is something you're almost certain not to find. That there's 3 volumes of Lewis Carroll's adult diaries that went missing in the 1930s. That would be a pretty cool thing to find. The family eventually gave the diaries to the British Library, so that would be where those 3 volumes would belong if I were to find them. But that'd be cool to be the person who found those. I did. About 20 years ago, I wrote an article, researched in this building, about Lewis Carroll's typewriter. He was really into gadgets, and he bought a typewriter in 1888, a Hammond #1 typewriter. And he never really used it to write books on or anything, but he wrote a few letters on it. He mostly used it to entertain children with. And I've written this article about Lewis Carroll and the typewriter, not knowing that the actual typewriter that he owned still existed. And a couple of years ago, I bought it. So that's pretty cool to have Lewis Carroll's typewriter. And when we had the Lewis Carroll Society here this spring, I did an exhibit for them, and we did a catalog of the exhibit. And in the back of the catalog, everybody got a little slip of paper that said, "'Twas Brillig," and it was typed on Lewis Carroll's typewriter. So they thought that was pretty cool. Yeah.
So your Holy Grail, have you tried to be the private detective?
No, simply because there's so many other people who know the tale of where it could be, where it might be, much better than I do, and who live in England and are able to and have done the detective work that anybody who did that would do. That I think we could probably say with not, you can never say anything with complete certainty, but with fair certainty that it's probably gone. But you never know. I mean, as anybody who's a rare book librarian will tell you, amazing stuff shows up all the time. And the fact that Peter finds this copy of Pandolsto, this 1588 romance that Shakespeare has written in the margins of as he's working on The Winter's Tale, is kind of far-fetched, but really not that far-fetched. Because people, I mean, somebody, just the other day there was an article in the New York Times about somebody who found a previously unknown inscribed copy of the first of Frankenstein, and it was like, one of a very few copies that were ever inscribed. And, somebody thinks they found the lost colony on a map. This map that's been sitting in a rare book library for like 400 years, and somebody went, I wonder what's under this little sticker. So I can't remember what the deal was, but they like moved something and like, oh look. So stuff like that turns up all the time. But people have been looking for those diaries for 70 or 80 years. I think they're probably gone.
Speaking of the Pandolsto, since I have students here from my history of the book class who I forced to read a couple of articles on Shakespeare authorship controversies, and they have all this background. And my question is, since number one, I liked your book, and this isn't really giving anything away because it actually, came out for the Stratfordian side, which books hardly ever do because the other side is kind of more exciting. But do you actually think, suppose that this actually happened in the book and somebody found the manuscript like you, do you actually think that would
It would shut them up?
shut up the...
I don't know. I think anybody who has access to the internet or owns a television has ample evidence that people are always going to want a conspiracy theory about even the most blatantly, obviously non-conspiratorial things. So I don't think, I don't know that it would completely shut them up, but I certainly think that if something like that was so obviously proved that Shakespeare of Stratford was also Shakespeare of the plays, I think certainly that Stratfordians would lose whatever academic traction they have, and would just be, some crackpots like anybody else. I mean, there certainly is an argument to be made that a man with no university education had no business knowing all the things he needed to know to write these plays. That's one of the reasons I wanted to introduce, and I'm certainly far from the first person to introduce this, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to introduce in the Bookman's Tale, this idea of Shakespeare interacting with Robert Cotton's library, because Cotton's library did contain all that information. And, but, I think you can point again and again and again to, if you go into an investigation wanting to discover a particular thing, that's what you're going to discover. So if you go at it saying, I'm going to prove that Shakespeare didn't write his plays, then you're going to end up proving that. If you go into it saying, I wonder who wrote Shakespeare's plays, let me see if I can figure out who it was, I think you're going to come up with the guy from Stratford. That's just my humble opinion. But yeah, I thought it was much more fun actually to have the novel be on the Stratford side, because as you say, it's a little sexier to prove that, you know, Jane Austen wrote all of Shakespeare's plays or something. But I think the reaction that I've gotten from readers is that when that discovery is made and when it seems to be that it's going to put that question to rest, has been sort of a great satisfaction, you know, that fantasizing that sort of thing could happen. It turns out that there's just as many people who want the right sort of happy ending as who want the controversial ending. You know?
Thank you. We'll leave a little time for Charlie.
Okay.
We'll sign some books.
And I'm happy to chat,
and you can
you know,
yeah,
informally.
And chat some more. Take a look at the materials on exhibit. Like I said, there's 12 books from Charlie's own collection here, which he has kindly lent us. And feel free to